Somewhere on the north coast of Jamaica, on 740 acres of land that once belonged to the family of Marcus Garvey, bulldozers are clearing forest that has stood since before Columbus arrived in the Caribbean. No referendum decided this, no global headline announced it. And unless you live in St. Ann Parish, or unless you happen to be watching this video right now, there is a strong chance you have never heard a single word about it. By the time this land is finished being built, it will hold homes, schools, shops, and roads for 4,000 people. It will be planned by Chinese engineers, financed through Chinese arrangements, and built by a company whose parent corporation has already constructed ports, railways, and bridges across 3 continents. Jamaicans are calling it a housing development. Some analysts are calling it something else entirely. A foothold, a blueprint. A quiet, methodical answer to a question most people in the West have not even thought to ask. What happens when a rising superpower stops asking for permission to build in your backyard and starts building in it instead? I am not here to hand you a conspiracy. I am here to hand you the documents, the numbers, and the history, and let you decide for yourself what is really happening on that stretch of coastline near Ocho Rios. Because whether you are Jamaican, Guyanese, Trinidadian, or simply someone who has ever wondered who actually controls the ground beneath a small nation's feet, what is happening at Mammy Bay concerns you more than you think. Stay with me because this story does not end where you expect it to. Before we go further, if you are new here, welcome to Caribbean Journey. We are a small channel with a simple mission to give the Caribbean diaspora the kind of serious, sourced, documentary-grade coverage of our region that mainstream media almost never bothers to make. No hype, no guessing, just verified facts told the way this region deserves. We are working toward 10,000 subscribers, and every single one of you watching this brings us closer. If you have not subscribed yet, now is a good moment because what you are about to hear is going to raise more questions than it answers. And I want you here for the follow-up videos where we chase down the answers together. Now, let's go back to where this story actually begins. Not in Jamaica, in a conference hall in Kazakhstan in the autumn of 2013. That is where Chinese President Xi Jinping first stood before world leaders and described something he called the Silk Road Economic Belt, a modern reimagining of the ancient trade routes that once connected China to Europe. Weeks later, in Indonesia, he unveiled its maritime twin, the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. Together, these two ideas would become known as the Belt and Road Initiative, and within a decade it would grow into the largest infrastructure financing campaign any single nation has ever attempted. Ports, railways, highways, power plants, fiber optic networks spread across more than 150 countries, financed by hundreds of billions of dollars in loans and direct investment. Most Western commentary about the Belt and Road fixates on Asia and Africa, Pakistan's economic corridor, Kenya's railways, Sri Lanka's ports. But here is the detail that gets left out of almost every mainstream retelling of this story. The Caribbean was never an afterthought in Beijing's planning. It was included from the very beginning, because the people who designed the Belt and Road understood something that centuries of Western foreign policy had almost taken for granted. Geography does not stop mattering just because a region is small. Look at where Jamaica actually sits on a map. It is positioned almost exactly between North and South America, along shipping corridors that carry a significant share of the world's containerized cargo. It sits roughly 14 hours by sea from the Panama Canal, the narrow choke point through which an enormous share of global maritime trade must pass. For over 2 centuries, the entire Caribbean basin has been treated by Washington as part of its natural sphere of influence, an assumption formalized all the way back in 1823 under the Monroe Doctrine, which warned European powers against establishing new footholds anywhere in the Americas. China is not Europe, and what is happening today does not look anything like 19th century colonization. But if you understand the Monroe Doctrine's underlying logic, that whoever controls infrastructure and influence in this hemisphere controls a strategic advantage that outlasts any single administration, then you start to understand exactly why a small parish in Jamaica has become so quietly important to policy analysts in Washington, Beijing, and beyond. So when did this actually begin for Jamaica? Not recently. The relationship goes back much further than most people realize. Jamaica established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China all the way back in 1972, making it one of the very first English-speaking Caribbean nations to do so. For decades that relationship stayed modest, small grants, cultural exchanges, the occasional stadium or convention center funded through Chinese assistance. Then came 2013, the same year the Belt and Road was born, and everything accelerated. That year, the China Harbour Engineering Company, known as CHEC, a subsidiary of one of the largest infrastructure conglomerates on Earth, began construction on what would become known as the North-South Highway, sometimes called Highway 2000, and colloquially nicknamed by ordinary Jamaicans as the Beijing Highway. The numbers behind that highway are worth sitting with for a moment. Roughly $700 million in cost. A journey across the island that once took 3.5 hours by the old winding roads reduced to under 90 minutes. Communities in the interior that had been functionally isolated for generations suddenly connected to Kingston, to Montego Bay, to the ports and airports that drive the island's economy. On paper, this looked like a triumph. Then Prime Minister Portia Simpson Miller herself called the highway an emancipation gift when it opened. And in some very real ways, it was exactly that. Faster travel, new job creation during construction, a tangible symbol that Jamaica could attract major infrastructure investment without waiting decades for Western institutions to move. But every gift like this comes with fine print, and the fine print on the Beijing Highway tells a more complicated story. To finance the project, Jamaica needed a loan from Chinese state banks. As part of the arrangement, CHEC was granted the right to own and operate the highway itself for 50 years. Not the Jamaican government, CHEC. And the tolls collected along that road do not go toward paying down Jamaica's national debt. They go directly to CHEC as company profit. To drive the full length of that highway in a standard car costs the equivalent of well over $10 American each way, a toll that by local standards is genuinely steep, expensive enough that Jamaica's own toll authority has acknowledged it puts the fastest route across the island out of reach for a large share of ordinary citizens. Think about what that actually means. The government of Jamaica built, with foreign financing, the single fastest road across its own island, and then handed operational control of that road to a foreign company for half a century in exchange for the debt that made the road possible in the first place. That is not a scandal. It is simply how this financing model works. But it is the pattern you need to hold in your mind, because it becomes the key to understanding everything that follows. As payment for building that same highway corridor, the Jamaican government also transferred land to CHEC, a lot of land. 1,200 acres, roughly 500 hectares, running alongside the route the highway itself had carved through St. Ann Parish. That land transfer was first agreed upon back in 2012, refined in the years after, and by 2017 the full handover was formally completed under then Finance Minister Audley Shaw. For years that land simply sat there. CHEC had originally floated the idea of building a hotel or a luxury villa resort on part of it, back when Portia Simpson Miller's government was still in office. Nothing came of it. The land waited. Then, roughly a decade later, the plan changed. Instead of a hotel, CHEC decided to build something far more permanent, a residential city. Welcome to Mammy Bay. If you drive north out of Ocho Rios along Jamaica's northern coast, past the cruise ship terminals and the resort strip that tourists know so well, you eventually reach a quieter stretch of coastline where the land opens into forest, rivers, and the ruins of an old sugar estate. This is Mammy Bay, and underneath its calm, unassuming surface, this land carries more layered history than almost anywhere else on the island. Long before European contact, this coastline was home to a redware culture settlement dating back to roughly 650 years after Christ, among the earliest documented indigenous communities anywhere in Jamaica. The Redware people were the ancestors of the Taíno, who would later occupy much of the island before Spanish colonization. Archaeological evidence of that settlement still exists at the mouth of the Little River, right where CHEC's development is now beginning to rise. By the 18th century, this same land had become the Mammee Bay estate, a working sugar plantation producing sugar, rum, and molasses through the labor of enslaved Africans. One small piece of the vast machinery of the Atlantic slave trade that built so much of the wealth flowing out of the Caribbean and into Europe at the time. A restored colonial-era water wheel from that plantation era still stands on the property today, once used to power operations at the neighboring Drax Hall estate. And there is one more thread running through this land's history that gives this story its emotional weight. Local activists and campaigners have long maintained that this same territory holds ancestral ties to the family of Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican-born father of Pan-Africanism, one of the most consequential black political thinkers of the 20th century, a man whose ideas about self-determination and economic independence for people of African descent still echo through movements around the world today. Whether or not every claim of connection can be independently verified with full certainty, the fact that this question is even being asked about land now being cleared for a Chinese-financed gated community tells you everything about why this story carries such weight far beyond its acreage. Redware settlements, Taíno heritage, and slave labor and sugar profits, possible ties to the ancestral home of Marcus Garvey, and now foreign-financed residential towers rising above it all. If you wanted to build a single piece of land that captured the entire 500-year story of power, land, and who gets to decide what happens to the Caribbean, you could not design a more fitting location than Mammy Bay. So what exactly is being built here? Let's be precise, because precision matters, and this is where a lot of coverage of this story starts to blur fact with speculation. The development covers 740 acres, roughly 300 hectares, out of the larger 1,200 acres CHEC originally received. Environmental filings indicate the first phase of construction will occupy about 100 of those acres, with roughly 60% given over to buildings and infrastructure and 40% preserved as green space, at least according to the environmental impact assessment submitted on CHEC's behalf. The finished development is planned to include more than 800 residential units, a mix of deluxe and standard 3-bedroom homes alongside 1- and 2-bedroom apartments spread across multi-story blocks, designed to eventually house somewhere between 4,000 and 4,500 residents, depending on which official estimate you consult. Beyond housing, plans call for a clubhouse, swimming pools, gyms, parks, nature trails, commercial and retail space, and in some versions of the plan, educational and community facilities as well. The entire build is structured across 6 phases, unfolding over roughly 5.5 years, with the first phase targeted for completion around 2026 and full build-out projected by 2030. This is not a resort. It is not a port. It is a fully planned residential settlement, a gated community on a scale that genuinely has no real precedent anywhere else in Jamaica's modern history. To understand what kind of company is actually behind this project, it helps to look at where else in the world China Harbour Engineering Company has already left its mark. CHEC is a subsidiary of China Communications Construction Company, one of the largest infrastructure conglomerates on the planet, with total international project value estimated well into the hundreds of billions of dollars. In Pakistan, CHEC-linked entities have played a central role in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a sprawling $67 billion undertaking that has delivered new highways, power plants, and the deepwater port at Gwadar, while simultaneously pushing Pakistan's debt obligations tied to that corridor to a level economists estimate at close to 30% of the country's entire gross domestic product. In East Africa, CCC-linked firms built the Mombasa to Nairobi Railway in Kenya, a project celebrated for cutting freight and passenger travel times dramatically, while also becoming the subject of years of public debate over its financing terms and long-term profitability. Across Southeast Asia, the same corporate family has built bridges, ports, and rail links from Cambodia to Malaysia, cementing its reputation as one of the most prolific builders of hard infrastructure anywhere in the developing world. Notice the pattern in every single one of those examples. Roads, railways, ports, concrete infrastructure connecting one point to another, built, financed, and in some cases operated, then left to function largely on its own. Mammy Bay breaks that pattern entirely. This is CHEC's most ambitious attempt anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, to build not infrastructure that people simply pass through, but a place where thousands of people are meant to actually live, raise families, and grow old. That distinction is not a minor technical detail. It is the single biggest reason serious analysts are watching this specific project so closely, because everything CHEC has learned building roads and ports across Asia and Africa is now being tested against an entirely different kind of challenge, one involving schools, playgrounds, local commerce, and the delicate, unpredictable dynamics of an actual living community. And here is a detail worth sitting with. This is the first major residential project China Harbour Engineering Company has attempted in the Caribbean. CHEC's entire reputation, built over decades across Pakistan, across East Africa, across Southeast Asia, rests on hard infrastructure, roads, bridges, ports, concrete and steel that connect 2 points on a map, housing thousands of actual human residents with all the community consultation, cultural sensitivity, and long-term social management that requires, is an entirely different kind of undertaking. Mammy Bay is not simply another project on CHEC's resume, it is an experiment. And if it succeeds, Jamaica may become the proving ground for a development model China intends to replicate right across Latin America and the wider global South. Now let's talk about the part of this story that has generated the most local controversy, because it deserves honest treatment rather than either dismissal or exaggeration. The land at Mammee Bay is not simply forest. It sits directly above a critical watershed. Environmental groups, including the Jamaica Beach Birthright Environmental Movement, have specifically flagged the site's location within the Rio Bueno Watershed Management Unit, an aquifer system that feeds Dunn's River, Roaring River, Bogue, and much of Ocho Rios and its surrounding communities, extending as far as neighboring St. Mary Parish. This same watershed also supplies a small hydroelectric plant that has operated on the property for years. The environmental impact assessment, prepared on CHEC's behalf, conducted by the consultancy Environmental Solutions Limited, concluded that the project would not generate significant adverse effects, provided appropriate mitigation measures are followed. CHEC has publicly committed to buffer zones around sensitive ecological areas, wastewater and grey water recycling systems, stormwater management infrastructure, and integration of renewable energy sources into the design. But here is the honest, unglamorous truth about environmental impact assessments anywhere in the world, not just in Jamaica. A promise made on paper during the planning phase is not the same thing as a promise kept during years of active construction, especially once cost pressures and construction deadlines start colliding with environmental best practice. Independent, ongoing environmental monitoring, not tied financially to the developer, will be the only way to know whether Mammy Bay actually delivers on these commitments once bulldozers are running at full pace across all 6 phases. Local campaigners, including longtime activist Kabu Maat Keru, who has been raising concerns about this specific site for well over a decade, argue that this particular stretch of limestone plateau is simply too ecologically and culturally significant to build on at this scale, regardless of what mitigation measures are promised. Government officials and CHEC representatives maintain the opposite, that all environmental and planning regulations are being fully respected. Both sides cannot simultaneously be correct about the long-term outcome. Only years of monitoring after construction will actually settle that question. Let's widen the lens now, because Mammy Bay does not exist in isolation. It is one small piece of a financial relationship between Jamaica and China that has been building for over 2 decades. And understanding the full scope of that relationship is the only way to judge whether this development represents opportunity, risk, or, more realistically, some complicated mixture of both. Between 2005 and 2021 alone, the China Development Bank and the China Export-Import Bank loaned Jamaica's government and state-owned enterprises approximately $2.1 billion, a meaningful share of the roughly $9 billion in Chinese financing extended across the entire Caribbean community during that same period. In April 2019, Jamaica formally signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative itself, becoming the 10th Caribbean nation to do so, joining Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname, Guyana, Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Dominica, Grenada, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic, all of whom had already signed their own agreements with Beijing in the years prior. Here is a number that tends to surprise people once they hear it, because it complicates the simple narrative that Jamaica has become dangerously indebted to China specifically. According to World Bank data, money owed to China's Export-Import Bank accounts for less than 4% of Jamaica's total outstanding debt. The overwhelming majority of what Jamaica owes is owed to Western institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank, the same lenders who structured Jamaica's brutal, multi-year austerity program after the country's debt-to-GDP ratio spiked to a staggering 147% back in 2012, one of the most severe debt crises anywhere in the hemisphere at the time. That context matters enormously, and it is precisely the context that gets flattened out of most viral videos on this topic. Jamaica did not turn to Chinese financing because it was naive or because it was somehow tricked. Jamaica turned to Chinese financing because it was already deeply indebted to Western institutions, already locked out of favorable terms on international capital markets, and desperately in need of infrastructure that neither Washington nor European capitals seem particularly interested in funding on competitive terms. As Guyana's own former president David Granger once put it plainly, a small nation cannot develop without infrastructure, and it does not have the capital to build that infrastructure alone. So whether the money comes from America, from Britain, or from China, it has to come from somewhere, and you take the best deal actually on the table. That is not weakness. That is the honest calculus every small developing nation in this hemisphere has had to make for generations, whether the lender wears a Western flag or an Eastern one. Now, let's address the phrase that dominates almost every piece of coverage on Chinese infrastructure lending anywhere in the world: debt trap diplomacy. The theory goes like this. China deliberately offers loans it knows a smaller nation cannot realistically repay, specifically so that when default happens, Beijing can seize strategic assets, ports, highways, land, and convert commercial leverage into permanent geopolitical control. The example cited constantly to prove this theory is Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, which the Sri Lankan government, unable to service its debt, eventually leased to a Chinese state company for 99 years. It is, without question, the single most repeated data point in this entire debate. But here is what serious, independent researchers who have actually studied this case in depth have found, and it complicates the simple story of this considerably. Scholars, including Deborah Brodigam at Johns Hopkins University and Meg Rithmeyer at Harvard Business School, have published detailed research showing that Chinese state banks have, in case after case across the developing world, chosen to restructure and renegotiate the terms of struggling loans far more often than they have chosen to seize the underlying asset. In fact, in the specific case of Hambantota, later academic analysis found that China ended up having to commit even more capital to keep the port functioning, exposing itself to greater financial risk and becoming entangled in complicated local politics, the near opposite of the clean, calculated asset grab the debt trap theory predicts. As of recent assessments, the port still has not become the commercial success China originally envisioned, even though shipping traffic through it has been slowly increasing. I want to be very clear about why I am telling you this. Not to defend Chinese lending practices uncritically, and not to wave away the very real risks that come with any nation's heavy reliance on a single foreign lender, but because a channel that claims to give you sourced, credible analysis has an obligation to tell you when the popular narrative and the actual documented evidence start to diverge. The truth about Chinese infrastructure financing in the Caribbean is not a simple story of villainy, and it is not a simple story of harmless partnership either. It is something messier, more human, and ultimately more useful for you to understand clearly. Risk without romanticizing it, opportunity without ignoring its costs. Here is what the real documented risk actually looks like, stripped of exaggeration. It is not China arriving with hidden intentions to seize Jamaican land through a secret contractual trap. The risk is subtler, slower, and in some ways harder to resist precisely because it looks so reasonable at every single step along the way. When a country builds critical infrastructure, a highway, a port, and eventually an entire residential community, using financing and construction from a single foreign partner, it does not just accumulate debt, it accumulates dependency. Dependency on that partner's technical standards, its maintenance contracts, its supply chains, its willingness to continue extending credit for the next project and the one after that. Every additional project deepens the relationship and narrows the realistic alternatives. That is not a conspiracy. That is simply how concentrated economic relationships function anywhere in the world, whether the partner is based in Beijing, in London, or in Washington. Now overlay onto that the specific nature of what is being built at Mammy Bay. A highway is infrastructure that connects two existing points. It carries traffic and then the traffic moves on. A residential city is fundamentally different. It creates a permanent population, real families, sending their children to schools built to a particular design standard, shopping in commercial spaces built around a particular retail concept, relying on municipal services built on a particular maintenance model, embedded on that land for generations, not simply passing through it. As one CHEC Commission planning document for a related nearby development put it, the design philosophy borrows influences from Caribbean architectural tradition while also introducing a more urban, Cosmopolitan building style historically more associated with Kingston or Montego Bay than with the quiet shores of Mammee Bay, now arriving on a stretch of coastline that has never seen anything like it before. Highways can eventually be renegotiated, rerouted, or even torn down and replaced if a relationship sours. Once you have built an entire city and moved thousands of people's lives into it, none of that is realistically reversible. This is precisely why serious analysts increasingly describe residential megadevelopments as a more permanent, more deeply embedded form of infrastructure influence than even ports or highways, however strategically valuable those remain. And this is where the geopolitical dimension of this story becomes impossible to ignore, however carefully you try to separate hard evidence from speculation. Jamaica is far from the only Caribbean nation living through this exact experiment right now, and looking at its neighbors tells you a great deal about how this pattern tends to unfold over time. In the Bahamas, a Hong Kong-based developer worked with financing from the China Export-Import Bank, roughly $2.5 billion in total, to build Baha Mar, the largest resort and casino complex anywhere in the Caribbean. That project became infamous for years of construction delays, cost overruns, and bitter legal disputes between the original American developer and the Chinese state-linked contractors brought in to actually finish the build. A cautionary tale about how quickly these partnerships can turn adversarial once schedules slip and money runs short. In Trinidad and Tobago, the first Caribbean nation to formally sign onto the Belt and Road back in 2018, Chinese financing has flowed into port expansion and transportation infrastructure, delivering real tangible improvements alongside the now familiar debate over financing transparency. In Barbados, Chinese-financed industrial park proposals have moved forward even as local environmental groups raise concerns strikingly similar to those now surrounding Mammy Bay, questions about land use, ecological impact, and how much genuine local input actually shapes these projects once financing is secured. In the Dominican Republic, Chinese financing has been extended toward long-discussed airport improvements that Western lenders had shown comparatively little urgency in funding. None of these projects are identical to one another, and treating them as a single monolithic story would be its own kind of oversimplification. But the pattern connecting all of them is unmistakable. A Caribbean nation identifies genuine, urgent infrastructure need. Western financing is slow, expensive, or simply unavailable on competitive terms. Chinese state-linked financing arrives instead, often quickly, often at scale, and almost always accompanied by Chinese contractors, Chinese engineering standards, and long-term financial arrangements whose full details rarely become fully public. Multiply that pattern across 8 separate CARICOM member states, all of whom have now signed their own Belt and Road agreements, and you begin to see Mammy Bay not as an isolated Jamaican story, but as the latest, most visible chapter in a regional transformation that has been building steadily for well over a decade. China's broader infrastructure strategy across the developing world has never been solely about individual projects viewed in isolation. It has been about the cumulative network those projects create over time. Analysts researching Chinese investment in ports specifically have long pointed to what is sometimes called dual-use infrastructure, facilities built primarily for civilian commercial purposes that nonetheless carry latent capacity to support other functions down the line, from intelligence gathering on shipping movements to, in a genuine crisis, logistical support for military assets. This is not a uniquely Chinese phenomenon. Great powers throughout history have built and financed infrastructure abroad with more than one strategic purpose in mind. But it is precisely why Western defense and foreign policy analysts have started paying unusually close attention to a housing development in a small Jamaican parish that, on its surface, has absolutely nothing to do with military strategy at all. Consider Mammy Bay's actual position on the map for a moment. It sits less than 30 minutes from Ocho Rios, home to one of the busiest cruise ports anywhere in the Caribbean. It sits within reasonable driving distance of Ian Fleming International Airport, which has undergone expansion work in recent years to accommodate larger aircraft. And it connects directly via the very same north-south highway that CHEC itself built years earlier, straight through to Kingston's shipping facilities and to Norman Manley International Airport on the island's southern coast. None of that positioning happened by accident. Every major CHEC project on this island connects logically and efficiently, to every other CHEC project on this island. That is not proof of a hidden military agenda, but it is proof of a company and a government behind it that thinks and plans in decades, not in single fiscal years, a discipline that Western infrastructure financing has struggled badly to match in recent memory. Now here is a number I want you to genuinely sit with, because it captures the entire imbalance of this story more clearly than almost anything else I could tell you. In 2021, the Biden administration launched what it called the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, explicitly framed as the West's answer to China's Belt and Road Initiative, a genuine attempt to offer developing nations, including right here in the Caribbean, a credible financing alternative. Its initial announced commitment specifically for Caribbean nations was $6 million. China's Belt and Road Initiative, meanwhile, has directed more than $50 billion annually toward global infrastructure spending in recent years. And by 2023, direct Chinese investment into Caribbean island nations alone had reached $3.3 billion, with associated infrastructure contracts totaling an estimated $32.2 billion region-wide. 6 million against 50 billion a year globally and tens of billions regionally. That is not a rounding error. That is not a modest funding gap. That is the difference between showing up to a conversation and not showing up to the conversation at all. And in the vacuum created by that absence, Caribbean nations facing real urgent infrastructure needs the Caribbean Development Bank itself estimates at roughly $30 billion across the region, have made the only rational choice available to them. They took the money that was actually on the table. This is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire story, and it is the truth that pure outrage-driven coverage of Mammy Bay almost always conveniently skips over. Criticizing China's growing presence in the Caribbean, without simultaneously offering the region a genuinely competitive alternative, does not stop that presence from expanding. It simply ensures the expansion continues entirely on Beijing's terms, without Western institutions in the room to shape, moderate, or provide meaningful competition to those terms at all. So let's bring this back down to the people this story is actually about, because it is easy to get lost in trillion-dollar geopolitics and forget that real human beings live on this land and will live in these buildings once they are finished. If you are Jamaican, whether you live in Kingston or in London, this story asks you a direct question. Who genuinely benefits when a foreign company builds housing on historically significant land tied to indigenous heritage, land tied to the legacy of slavery, land possibly tied to the ancestral home of one of the most important Pan-Africanist thinkers this island has ever produced? Is it primarily the 4,000 future residents who will eventually live there? Is it the construction workers earning wages during the build phase? Is it CHEC and its shareholders on the other side of the planet? Realistically, it is almost certainly some genuine combination of all three. The exact proportions of who wins and who bears the long-term cost remain deliberately unclear because full financial transparency around this specific project's revenue-sharing arrangements has simply not been made public. If you are Guyanese, this story should resonate with you for an entirely different but equally urgent reason. Guyana signed its own Belt and Road Agreement with China back in July 2018, and Chinese construction and financing interest across Guyana's own infrastructure boom, driven by its extraordinary offshore oil discoveries, has been accelerating in remarkably similar patterns. The same fundamental questions Jamaica is now confronting at Mammy Bay. Questions about land, about long-term debt structures, about who genuinely holds leverage once a project is finished, are questions Guyana will inevitably have to confront at a significantly larger scale in the years directly ahead, given the sheer volume of capital now flowing into that economy. If you are Trinidadian, you were actually the very first Caribbean nation to sign on to the Belt and Road, all the way back in May 2018, making Trinidad and Tobago something of an early test case for exactly this kind of relationship, years before Jamaica ever followed suit. Let's make this even more concrete, because abstract geopolitics rarely changes how anyone actually lives their life, but specific, personal stakes often do. If you are a Jamaican who left for London decades ago, and you still own land or still have family living near St. Anne Parish, the questions raised tonight are not academic. They are questions about whether the watershed feeding water to your relative's community will still be clean in 10 years. They are questions about whether property values near Mammy Bay will rise in ways that benefit families who have owned land there for generations, or rise in ways that quietly price out the very people whose ancestors worked that land under slavery and colonialism in the first place. If you are Guyanese and living in New York or Toronto, watching your homeland's oil wealth transform Georgetown's skyline in real time, this story is essentially a preview of decisions your own country will be forced to make at an even larger scale, and likely sooner than most people currently expect. Every dollar of oil revenue flowing into Guyana right now increases the country's ability to finance its own infrastructure independently. But it also increases the appetite of every major global lender, Chinese, American, and European alike, to compete for a piece of that financing relationship. The precedent Jamaica sets at Mammee Bay, for better or worse, will shape the terms Guyana is offered next. If you are Trinidadian in Toronto, and Trinidad and Tobago has already been down this road longer than any other CARICOM nation, the honest question worth asking your own family back home is simple. Has 7 years of Belt and Road partnership genuinely delivered the infrastructure improvements it promised, and at what long-term cost? That is not a rhetorical question. It is one worth putting directly to relatives who have watched the ports and highways change firsthand. Wherever you are watching this from tonight, London, Toronto, New York, Miami, Kingston, or Georgetown, the through line connecting all of these Caribbean nations is precisely the same. Small economies, urgent and legitimate infrastructure needs, limited access to competitively priced Western capital, and one single global superpower consistently willing to show up with a checkbook, while other potential partners largely remain on the sidelines. That is not a Jamaica story, that is a Caribbean story. And it is unfolding in real time, right now, while most of the diaspora is watching literally anything else. Let's talk honestly and directly about what happens next, because this is precisely where the story stops being purely historical and starts becoming genuinely predictive. Construction at Mammee Bay is already actively underway. Land preparation began months before actual building started, and by mid-2025, CHEC representatives on site confirmed construction had formally commenced. Phase 1 is targeted for completion around 2026. Full 6-phase build-out is projected through 2030. Environmental assessments continue running in parallel with active construction, and community consultations, however imperfect they may genuinely be, remain ongoing. This means the world will not need to wait decades to see meaningful, tangible results here. Within the next several years, we will have real, observable evidence of whether Mammy Bay actually becomes what its promotional materials describe, a sustainably designed, community-centered residential development that genuinely benefits the parish around it, or whether it instead becomes a genuine cautionary tale, environmental degradation to a critical watershed, permanent displacement of historical and cultural memory, and a template other nations watching closely from Africa, from Southeast Asia, from right across Latin America, ultimately decide not to replicate within their own borders. Because make absolutely no mistake about the stakes riding on this single project. Countries across the global south are watching Jamaica extremely closely right now. If Mammee Bay succeeds and genuinely delivers on its promises, expect this exact model, Chinese-financed, Chinese-built, fully planned residential cities, to expand rapidly across other small island and developing nations desperately hungry for the same kind of large-scale, turnkey investment. If Mammee Bay fails, if the watershed suffers lasting damage, if local communities feel genuinely excluded from the benefits their own land is generating, it hands real, concrete ammunition to critics of the entire Belt and Road model right at a moment when China itself is already recalibrating that initiative towards smaller, more environmentally cautious projects following roughly a decade of very large, very debt-heavy undertakings elsewhere around the world. Either way, Jamaica did not ask to become the test case for this global question. But Jamaica has become exactly that anyway, whether Kingston or Beijing or Washington ever explicitly intended it that way or not. So let me leave you with the honest, complicated truth this entire story adds up to, because after everything we have walked through together tonight, a clean, simple conclusion would frankly be dishonest. Mammee Bay is not a secret military base disguised as suburban housing. It is not a sinister foreign plot to somehow steal Jamaican sovereignty overnight. But it is also not simply a straightforward, uncomplicated housing development either. and treating it as though it were either of those two extremes badly misses what is actually happening on that coastline right now. What it genuinely is the clearest, most concrete example currently visible anywhere in the Caribbean of a much larger global shift already well underway. The era where Western institutions could assume automatic, uncontested influence over infrastructure development anywhere in this hemisphere is already over, whether Washington has fully processed that shift yet or not. China has demonstrated, repeatedly and consistently across the developing world, both the financial capacity and the sheer institutional willingness to build what other nations urgently need. On timelines competing lenders have consistently failed to match. Whether that ultimately proves to be a genuine net benefit for the Caribbean, or the early foundation of a far deeper, more permanent kind of long-term dependency, will not be decided by any single video, mine or anyone else's. It will be decided, phase by phase over the next several years, on 740 acres of ancestral, historically layered Jamaican land, by decisions largely made in boardrooms most Jamaicans will genuinely never see. I want to leave you with a genuine question tonight. Not the kind of empty engagement bait so many channels rely on, but a real question I would like you to actually sit with, and if you have an honest answer, I would love to read it in the comments below. Given everything you have just heard tonight, the debt structures, the ecological stakes, the layered history running underneath this land, and the genuine absence of any serious competing offer from Western institutions, do you believe Jamaica, and by extension the wider Caribbean, is making the most pragmatic choice realistically available to it right now? Or is the region simply trading one set of foreign dependencies it has lived under for centuries for an entirely new one, dressed up in a more modern architectural style? There is no single correct answer here, and I genuinely do not claim to have one myself. But this is exactly the kind of conversation this channel exists to have with you, honestly, patiently, and always grounded in verified fact, rather than outrage for its own sake. If tonight's video gave you something genuinely worth thinking about, the single most useful thing you can do right now is subscribe, because we are steadily building toward 10,000 subscribers, and every one of you watching and engaging with content like this is what allows Caribbean Journey to keep producing the kind of deep-sourced, diaspora-relevant documentaries that, frankly, almost nobody else in this space is bothering to make. We will be following the story as it develops because Mammy Bay is not finished, it is barely beginning. And what gets built on that coastline over the next 5 years may end up telling us more about the future of the entire Caribbean than almost any other single project happening anywhere in this region right now. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.